Welcome back to Lightroom Essentials, and in this section of the video we're going to be looking at development basics. Once we leave the library and the organizational side of Lightroom, we are into the develop module, which is where we convert raw files into either TIFFs or JPEGs. We have a different workspace and it's worth having a quick look at that here and now. On the left hand sidebar, which again is closable if you want to have more real estate for your image, we have presets, which are simply that. They're automated actions that you can use quickly to make quite dramatic changes to your images. We have snapshots, which is a moment frozen in time. You can basically specify a point of your workflow where you want to say, right, I want to use that as a reference for any future changes that I make, and you can snap between those later on. History records every step that you take with an image and are all reversible, so you can go back to any point in your workflow, which is fantastic. And collections are exactly the same as we explored in the Lightroom Explorer. On the right sidebar, this is where the magic happens. This is your development module, and we will be introducing shortly all of these different headings in terms of what they can do and all these different icons, and going through the entire process of not just what we can do with these tools, but why. So let's get started. The first thing we really need to look at here is, what is raw development? When we record raw files in our digital cameras, they are recording a potential range of values for color and luminosity for every pixel on your sensor. Nothing is carved in stone, and this offers us a huge amount of flexibility. Digital sensors record light in very specific ways, and the further right you go in the histogram, the more sensitive they are to light. So you will see in this histogram on the right here, we have an image that has been exposed to the right while watching the highlights. So nothing is clipped at the highlight end, and the shadows have been opened up tremendously. There's no actually black pixels in this image. So in terms of a good exposure, this image is one of those. In terms of a creative and expressive landscape photograph, this is not the case. It's a raw file, and its intention is to harvest light. It is not to be expressive in its own right. So we're in a scenario here where we have a raw file in our development module, and we have a range of tools from all of these listed on the right hand side with which we can make fairly dramatic and significant changes. Now, if I've taken a snapshot of the starting process here, and I'm not going to go through huge amounts of detail in terms of what I am doing and why, but all I'm doing is demonstrating that I can make massive and significant changes to this image in seconds. And if I create another snapshot here, then we can flick between those two and see that that is a huge amount of change. If I reset that and go into a black and white scenario and make another set of changes, I can very quickly create another image, which I can create another snapshot, which not only is hugely different from the first one, but it's massively different from the raw file. It's up to me how I want to portray this scene. Obviously in this scenario it's very bright and airy and extremely graphic. In this scene it's very cool and contrasty and has a totally different feel, and none of them look like the raw file. Now I can go through this process time and time again, and the word that's going to come back every single time we talk about the development module is intention. It's up to you, the photographer, to decide what you want to show, how you want to show it, what moods you want to evoke in your viewers, and what reaction emotionally and psychologically you want to bring out of your viewers as well. You have an incredible tool at your disposal, and it's up to you to use it. You give someone a guitar, if they've never played a guitar before, they're not going to sound like Jimi Hendrix. If you put that guitar in the hands of someone who's been playing for 30 years, obviously you get something that's a significant thing. The tool hasn't changed, it's just how it's being used has changed. So let's move on to the next stage of the video, and we'll introduce all these various tools that we can use, and then later on we can move on to why we're going to use them and how we can use them to create images that are expressive and a lot more dramatic for people. Before we start with some of the adjustment panels on the right hand side here, I want to cover a couple of these icons right here before we get going. The first is the sensor spot removal tool, and anyone who is shot with a digital camera knows that sensor spots can become a problem. Sensor spots are little specks of dust that get onto the digital sensor, usually from changing lenses, or sometimes using zoom lenses can actually suck air into the camera body itself. This image here in particular, as you can see, there are quite a few very evident spots, and I know that there are many others hidden as well. The sensor spot removal tool, once it is highlighted, you can use, if you have a scrolling type mouse, you can vary the size of the brush, or you can use this tool here. Typically it's not something you would feather, and opacity, again, I would always go for 100%. I tend to use the heal instead of clone. They're very much the same. Heal is basically an automated setting. So if you click heal, it will choose a place to basically clone onto where that sensor spot was and gets rid of it. So once you click that button again, you see that the spots disappear. There's a very handy tool down here called Visualize Spots. Some of the fainter ones are quite difficult to see, but using this Visualize Spots tool creates a mask which basically highlights the spots with these little circles, and you can just quickly go through the image. I mean, this is an image that would take ages. You know, sometimes you can spend an hour doing these types of things, but you know, that is the price we pay sometimes. But anyway, that is how we use the sensor spot tool, and once you have familiarized yourself with that, you can very quickly go through and get rid of all the sensor spots in your image. That is something I would always start with if it's an image I was serious about working. The second tool I want to cover here is the crop tool. Most contemporary digital SLRs have a 3:2 ratio sensor, the typical 35mm sensor ratio. And what that does is it forces you into a creative choice, in that if you want to compose a full frame scene in camera, it will be in a ratio of 3:2. That is not always going to be the most appropriate. People out there for shooting film still shoot pano cameras, they shoot 6x6, they shoot 10x8. So the bottom line is that there are other creative choices out there, but traditionally digital cameras all have a 3:2 sensor. Now, when I took this particular image in the rice terraces of southern China, I saw this as some type of panoramic image. And I have entered custom panoramic formats here because Lightroom comes with all the standards. So 1:1 will crop it into a square. 4:5 is in there, which is another popular traditional format, and that works particularly nicely, I think, as a vertical. However, I did see it as probably a 2.5:1 panoramic. And what that has allowed me quickly to do is crop out a lot of this negative space, or what I perceive to be negative space, at the top of the frame, and has limited the frame to the rice terraces and this big clump of bamboo. And if I click the return key, we now have a much more concise image to my mind. And this is what the cropping tool does. It buys us this creative choice. Later, once we come on to images that have horizons, the spirit level tool here can be used to level those horizons, and at the end of the day, that is an incredibly powerful tool in its own right. This is all I'm going to say for now about cropping, but we will be coming back to it on numerous occasions in the future with various images that we work. In the last part of this video, I want to introduce the tools that we're going to be using throughout the rest of the videos. We cover them in the PDF, but it's worth having a look at them just now so that by the time we get to the why we're using them, you're much more familiar with them. We've covered the crop tool and the spot removal tool, and I just want to highlight some of the main ones that we're going to be using here on the right hand side. The basic panel covers a couple of things, mainly color and your exposure. Now, the histogram here is a live histogram. Anything you do to any of these sliders is going to affect the histogram above. Now, you will notice that as I click the exposure slider, the mid-tone section of the histogram is highlighted. And that is because I am predominantly targeting midtones. If I look at the highlight slider and move that to the left, it means I'm mainly targeting highlights. And of course, you can go both directions with those. Shadows, intuitively, you know that you're opening up shadows. The whites is just going to brighten the very right-hand side of that frame. And you can see quite quickly, I'm just going to do a little bit of fine-tuning here to create something that looks a little bit more reasonable. Those 5 sliders, blacks, whites, shadows, highlights and exposure, give you complete control over this histogram and this image in terms of how it looks, in terms of what dynamic range is going to be represented in your images. The temperature slider is very much a mood slider because you're cooling things down by moving it to the left and you're warming things up by moving it to the right. And you can basically do the whole thing by feel, or you can go into one of these presets and find something that's kind of straight out the camera or much more intuitively normal, shall we say. Another very intuitive way we can affect our white balance is to use the white balance selector tool. And if we click on that, we can target an area within the image that we want to be neutral. And by clicking on that, we have corrected for any imperfections in our white balance. We're basically corrected for tint and temperature. Now, that's a great starting off point because it's removed color casts. And if we want to gently warm the image, that's fine. Or if we want to cool the image, that's also fine. But the white balance selector tool has got us very quickly to a neutral point where the image is expected to be neutral. Obviously, if you click on an image that is very warmly colored and expect it to make a neutral color out of it, then the whole white balance of the image is going to be wrong. But as long as you select an area that is supposed to be neutral, then it will give you a very good starting off point for your white balance. The final things on this particular one are clarity is a way to deal with detail. You need to be quite careful not to introduce halos with this. If you go way over the top, things can get very, very contrasty indeed. And likewise, if you get very, very soft, you are going to produce some type of haloing. But again, clarity deals with detail. In some ways, it's a texture slider. Vibrance will target the saturation of colors that are not already saturated, whereas saturation will deal with overall saturation. The tone curve is a familiar sight for most people. With this little clicking tool here, we can brighten specific tones. So if we just want to target those highlights, if we want to bring the midtones down a bit and then darken those shadows a touch, that gives you your sort of very mild S curve, which is going to produce a bit more contrast than we had before. Finally, in here we have detail, which is where we introduce sharpening and noise reduction, and both of those we're actually going to cover in a future video as well. So I'm just making people aware of where they are in terms of their usefulness. If we compare that image with what we started with, It's quite dramatic, and we can see what we can do with a raw file, even if it's slightly underexposed as this one was. We're certainly in a position now where we can bring out an awful lot more detail. If you try doing that with a JPEG, it will fall apart. This is why we shoot in RAW. So we will move forward from here very much to discuss not just the how to do things, but the why. We're going to be spending quite a bit of time discussing that old word we've been using from very early in this course, which is intent. It's why you're doing it is the important thing.